Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Sky Sports F1 podcast with me, Matt Baker. We've almost got cars on track. Depending on when you're watching this, there might already be cars on track at testing in Bahrain. And we wanted to provide you with a bit of a toolkit, a bit of a what's going on in testing Q&A. And the person we've got in is Bernie Collins. There was no one else really. Bernie, welcome. How are you?
Hey Matt, that's quite the introduction, but yeah, so close to cars on track, and it's going to be a really interesting few days ahead.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, I can't believe, I don't know where the winter's gone. It's gone by in a flash, hasn't it? How's your winter been? All good and excited for the season ahead?
Yeah, it's always nice to have a bit of a sort of some downtime and then get ready to go again. And I think this is going to be, we're all hoping for a much more exciting year, a bit more close in terms of the performance level. So let's see what happens.
Yeah. Now, before we get on some of the brilliant questions that you guys have sent in, I want to ask you, Bernie, as a strategist, as someone who's been to many testing sessions, I'm sure, in their career, was this a period that you were excited about? Were you nervous? Because ultimately, I guess, it's the first time the whole team gets to see what are we working with this year? What are the elements of the car that we've got? Is it going to be a good car? Is it going to be a tough year for us as a team?
Yeah, I think testing's really exciting. You know, everything in the factories, everything about car build has really built up to this moment. Yes, the guys have been fit to do their shakedown that they've done earlier this week or last week, but this is it. This is the first time that you really get to see it in the flesh, and you really get to see it against other teams. The experience is very different across your roles within the team. So when I did performance engineering at McLaren, you're there in the thick of it. This is a car that you're trying to work out brake temperatures for, performance for. You're really getting into it. It's a long, long day when you're working at the testing. As a strategist, it was slightly different. So some teams split it. Not all of the strategists attend the tests because there's only 10 cars on track, as we all know. So there's not loads to get involved with on the ground. So a lot of strategists stay back at the factory and watch the numbers come in from there. The most difficult thing as a strategist is everyone wants to know how the car is going to be, and that answer isn't always clear during testing.
Yeah, we're going to get onto sandbagging in a bit because a lot of people asked how much they can read into the numbers that we see in testing. Andrew on Instagram wants to know, in terms of strategies, what are the teams doing at this time of year, and how far ahead are you looking as a strategist at testing? What's on your mind? What are the key things you're looking out for?
Hi Andrew. So yeah, the big thing is obviously testing this year taking place in Bahrain and the first race in Bahrain. So that's your first focus. What can you learn ahead of Bahrain? The big thing with testing is we can run the 5 different compounds that Pirelli has. So we can run multiple compounds, whereas over a race weekend, we only run 3. So you're trying to, at this stage of the year, find out, have there been any changes to the tyres from Pirelli's side? Is the soft going to be a big step from the medium, whereas it wasn't in previous years? So that's the big thing you're trying to find out is, can you learn as much about the tyres, given either the pace delta between the tyres, the degradation of the tyres, or the life? So what can we tell about tyres? That's the big strategist focused. The second thing then is, where does our car sit? How easy is qualifying going to be in Bahrain next weekend? How difficult is qualifying going to be? So you're trying to judge how many tyres you might need through qualifying, how many tyres you might need through the race. So you're trying to get a feel of, are you right at the front of the field where everyone would love to be, or are you struggling a little bit more? So it's trying to understand where you are in the pecking order.
We alluded to it there a little bit with regards to obviously this being Bahrain, a week before you go to race in Bahrain. But what as a strategist would you, or as a team in general, would you like? Does Bahrain work for the teams? Is that good for them? Because obviously they do get data on the first race. Or historically, you know, we've obviously gone to Barcelona or Jerez before that, even tracks that aren't even on the calendar. So what's the preference from a team point of view?
I think it's a real mix. Bahrain brings some really good advantages. The first one being the guaranteed weather. We've often went to Barcelona or Jerez for 3 days in February and had rain. And you don't do as much learning in the rain. Yes, obviously we do sometimes run in the rain during the year, maybe 2023 more than most. But we are trying to get that dry weather data. We're trying to get the maximum amount of running. So Bahrain does help that. You're sort of guarantee good temperatures, good track temperature, closer to what you have during the year. Difficulties with Bahrain over Barcelona, there's a few. So one is Bahrain's really high degradation circuit. It's very rough track, so it does bring high deg in the tyres. Now, the big difficulty in that is if you're trying to do a front wing compare, so you're trying to do 2 front wings on the car, your tyres when you go out for the second run would be in very different condition. So unless you use two sets of tyres, it's very difficult to get a straight compare across the two. So that's one difficulty in Bahrain. Logistics is the second one. In Barcelona, you'd have teams with vans driving out once or twice a day from the factory with new parts, new upgrade. Maybe things have gone wrong and they'll have worked on a modification overnight, and it'll just be vans driving back and forth with parts. Much more difficult to do in Bahrain. So there is that sort of logistic nightmare, if you like. But one of the other positives, I guess, is you're set up for the first race. The garage is set up, the guys are set up, everything is ready then for the first race. So normally where teams might have even brought a different garage layout or different computer system or different pit wall, whatever it might be, you get a really good test at that, and then you don't have to take it apart to go to the first race. So there's advantages and disadvantages. On the whole, it works. I think a few years ago we had a 3-day test maybe at Barcelona, and then we moved to Bahrain. That was probably the perfect mix of the two.
Yeah.
But yeah, with the limited testing, I think it's an okay shot.
I remember going through an airport 2 testing and seeing team members with front wings as not hand luggage, but they would have to check that in. But it literally is as almost sort of basic and rudimentary as that, isn't it? That you see people. I mean, did you ever have to carry like any carbon fibre out with you as part of your checked luggage?
I remember for it was McLaren when I was working there, and we went to, it must have been at the end of the year we were doing a test, so we went out to Abu Dhabi, and I remember bringing a rear suspension, so I had a rear upright and a drive shaft, and a box with all this stuff trying to arrive. Oh no, it must have been Bahrain actually, and just like a massive box of parts, trying to get it through airport security, picking it up off the luggage carousel. It was just a bit of a nightmare, but it did allow me a few days extra in Bahrain in the sun when I was waiting for those parts to be used before I was at the track. So it was pros and cons, but you get a lot of that of flights are going out quite regularly with different people, so you'll get people maximising their luggage on the way out, which is an inefficient way to do it, but it is about getting parts there quickly and reacting to whatever you can see. I think this year is going to be maybe a little bit different because we've seen lots of shakedowns from teams. So hopefully those first day niggles are sort of well in the bag. It's also, we've not had a big regulation change, so hopefully they're not seeing parts that are breaking down immediately on day one that they need to ship new stuff out to. So hopefully it's a bit more robust than what we've seen maybe last year.
Yeah. It's just funny seeing people walking through the airport with these, putting them on their trolley with their suitcases as well. It's quite funny.
Like, did you pack this yourself? Well, no, not quite.
Yeah, well, not quite. Yeah. Whole team of engineers have packed it, yeah. Let's move on. Emily on Instagram wants to know, and I love this question because we think we know, but I reckon you might have some intel on this. What does the green stuff and the grid thingy on the cars actually do? Love that, Emily.
Well, so let's do it one at a time. So the green stuff is called FlowViz. And it is basically just paint, a very simple paint that we can put on the car that we then are trying to put the car through certain conditions. So it depends on what we're trying to test. But typically you'll see the paint going on a front or a rear wing or some aero component of the car. Now, when we test the car in the wind tunnel or in CFD, so computer modelling in the factory, all of that testing is trying to predict how the flow will go over that component. And that's what aerodynamics are trying to do. They're trying to get a very controlled flow of air over the component. That paint is just a visual way of seeing that airflow. So you're trying to get the car out on track quickly, get the car to drive around, the paint will dry and you literally be fit to see how the air is flowing over the paint. Comes back into the garage, gets photographed, sent back to the factory or viewed by people in the garage depending on the setup of the team, and then they can start to see the visualize of what they expected the airflow to do and how it's doing. And it's really useful on rear wings, front wings and stuff because it's quick to put on, it's quick to get the results, so it's a very efficient way of doing it. And we started to see teams use different colours. They'll use different colours on different components or so you can see where the paint has come from originally. And we've started to see some teams use like a UV one, so you can only see under a certain light. So it means that us from the outside can't necessarily see the results, or their competitor next door can't see the results, but they can just by shining a UV light on it. The second question then being the sort of multitude of things that we see hung off the car in different areas. So they're called an aero rake because they look a bit like a rake, I guess. But you basically have little tubes that are positioned around the car. And again, they're little sensors that are trying to pick up what the air pressure is at that point on the car. So they're a much more convenient way of picking up flow away from the car surface. So the flow is obviously very good on the surface, and the rake's very good on this surrounding the car. So good to see, you know, off the back of the car how post the rear wing there is looking, or off the side of a front brake duct, whatever it might be. They're obviously much more hard work. There's a lot of design that goes into them to make sure they're picking up air in the right place. They need to be mounted on the car, and all the sensors that go with it need to be mounted on the car. Obviously, when you run that on the car, you affect the airflow then further back from that. So you're just trying to get a test in one position, and there's time involved in taking it off the car then as well. So there's a lot of time involved in those rakes. But you would hear a lot of information being given the drivers. They've been told to drive a certain way, have a certain distance to the car in front, often with a rake on, avoid the curbs so you don't damage it or whatever it might be. So there's lots of information we're trying to pick up from the car, but it's all about trying to make sure the car matches the model that we have in the factory. Because if the base car doesn't match, then any upgrades that you bring during the year will be a struggle to get to work.
That's really, really well put. And a follow up on that is how likely is it your computer simulations and the wind tunnel time correlate to what actually comes out in practice? Is that normally a 98%, 99% kind of a link, or is it often much wilder than that, particularly, I guess, if a regulation's just changed?
Yeah, I think, you know, if we think back to a few years ago with the poor percent, or lots of cars getting themselves in a lot of trouble with their wind tunnel not matching, you know, I think Mercedes expected their previous car to be a lot more performant than it was. So I think that the percentage is a lot less than you've described there. You know, I think that 97, 98 is very, very high. I think it's a lot less correlation than that, which is why all of the teams do so much work on it during testing. And it is just about the model is obviously in this ideal world, you know, the model that we have in the computer. Whereas if you just think of Bahrain, it's a very rough track. All the corners maybe have a slightly different roughness. There's heat coming off the track from the tarmac as well, which is disturbing the airflow around that. So there's so many interactions that mean it's very difficult to get this perfect model to work in the real world. Like, the perfect model probably works 98% accurately on very smooth tarmac with a given heat coming off it, whatever the case may be. But that's not what we get in real life, where we get side winds or sand or a car in front or whatever. So there's lots and lots going on. That means you're trying to make sure the car works in all these different environments.
And just finally on FlowViz, is it literally just paint? Just sort of fluorescent paint? I mean, Formula One is full of technical, amazing inventions and things that are so complex. Is it simply paint?
I think it's maybe a little bit more complex than just the paint you would buy down the hardware store, but effectively it is just running paint. It's, you know, running so they can spray it on. You know, you can see them spraying it on with a gun in the back of the garage, and it needs to dry sort of within half a lap. So it's got quite precise sort of drying times and a method for putting it on. But yeah, it's as far as I know, and someone can correct me when I'm wrong, but as far as I know, it's not really complex in terms of the liquid itself.
Formula One is always full of surprises. I'm sure it's still a very expensive component to buy.
Just to add to that, like, you know, there's other little ways that we do things like that. You know, for example, you just get a paint pen on the edge of the floor and check if the floor is rubbing against the tyre, because the paint will have worn off. So yes, there's some very, very high-tech things, but there are some things that actually, you know, an old way or a very, you know, not technical way does the job just as well. And you'll just mark up something with a little like white marker or yellow marker. That's gone, that it's touching. If it's still there, then you're fine, you know. It's easy. It's much easier than putting a camera on.
Arts and crafts, a very, very advanced form of arts and crafts. Let's move on to a few more questions. This is from Milos on Instagram. Why can't the teams use coloured carbon fibre? And this is this is part of the understanding of carbon fibre, but obviously this year we've seen a lot of the liveries. A lot of teams have chosen to go darker because obviously it's saving weight on paint. Is there a way that you could colour carbon fibre?
So I believe there is methods of colouring carbon fibre, because you can either colour the resin, which would give a little bit, but it's not going to look as good as the paint that we currently have. And so carbon fibre works best when it's black. just because the resins and everything work well. So you could tinge it, but you wouldn't get, like a Ferrari red. You'd get like a very sort of dull sheen to it, I think. The big problem with colouring the component, for example, is that if you can imagine a side pod on a car, and when it lines up and they match it together, that's when they paint it. Whereas if you're putting the paint on at the manufacturing level, you have to be very clear that's going to end up in the right position further down the line in terms of the car. So you're making the manufacturing of that component much, much more complicated, even if you could get all of the correct shapes on it. I think that there's potential that we start the year with a lot of these carbon liveries or carbon strong liveries. And as teams find ways to save weight through the year, then more and more paint might go back on, because the car is generally the heaviest at the beginning of the year. And then teams start to find ways to make it lighter as they build knowledge and reliability, or whatever the case may be. And as we get more and more into the regulations, then hopefully teams will start to go down that path as well.
There's hope yet for brightly coloured cars for Crofty. He's going to identify them as they go around the track. Sandbagging, I mentioned it a little bit earlier. This is one of the words that we're going to hear over and over again at testing. So, Bernie, just clarify what sandbagging is and how teams use it to gain an advantage.
Well, so sandbagging is a term that's used to refer to teams hiding their true performance. And there's various ways that teams can hide their true performance, and sometimes teams aren't even really trying to hide their true performance, or just doing their own test plan. But we've had many years where testing particularly is very difficult to see where the car lies. The first true read that we get of testing is qualifying in Bahrain Saturday a week away. So that is the first time that you really, really know what the gap is between the cars, whatever. So in testing, it's really difficult to tell car pace. There's a few reasons. Track temperature changes through the day. Track improves throughout the day. Drivers are, like we say, testing different wings or different rakes or whatever the case may be. Even when we get like a proper low fuel run, teams could be running higher fuel, maybe 20 or 30 kgs. 10 kg of fuels, maybe 3/10 around Bahrain. So small difference in fuel level will make a big difference in what we see in performance. Teams can be running different engine modes or running the engine down a little bit. That might be because they don't want to show their pace, or it might be because there's a genuine engine worry that they're trying to get that engine through testing, or whatever the case may be. Teams will be limited in terms of the number of like high performance laps they can run on an engine, even through the Bahrain test. So they'll be using them when they think is the best. They'll be using the softest tyres when they think is the best. So there's loads of reasons that teams do it, or at least from our side, it looks like they're doing it. And teams are sort of, when they're running a test, they're probably running 40 kg, 30, 40 kg is sort of the baseline level. And that's because that's where you spend most of your time. If you think of the race starting at 100 and finishing 0, somewhere around that mid-level is where you want to be. So there's loads of complex reasons why teams do it. Sometimes going for the out-and-out fast run, teams do it, but at very different times, or get a bit of traffic. Or we've seen in previous years Red Bull not using DRS. We've seen a few years ago Mercedes not using the softest compounds. Is it an advantage? I don't know. Like the big advantage maybe comes in Bahrain qualifying, where maybe your competitor slightly underestimated how good you're going to be, and haven't saved the correct number of tyres for Q3, for example. But I've often felt that it's just about doing your own test program. It's about you learning what you need to know. If your biggest difficulty last year was high fuel, then that's what your focus should be on testing this year, whatever the case may be. So it's a really complicated subject, and you always got team managers coming into the mission control and saying, "Where do you think our car is?" It's always a really difficult question to answer.
Yeah. And what percentage of the time is spent from a team looking outward? I guess it depends how good you feel inside, right? But, are you looking out and going, have you got people looking at other teams going, yeah, I think they're actually on a low fuel run or on a high fuel run? How does that work?
You've got lots of teams looking outward for a variety of things. So you'd have camera guys in the pit lane. They'll be just literally snapshotting all the other cars, all the little interesting details. People will be looking at that back at the factory to see what can we learn, what can we do differently. Same applies to pit walls and pit equipment and everything in between. You get a lot of, normally like the strategy team will be back at the factory looking at the different lap times. Is it high or low fuel? Is it a long run? what engine modes are they using, all these different things. So you're just trying to find any piece of data that you can to build a model. Some of that is because actually by looking at other teams' low fuel runs, for example, if they run 2 compounds and they have got a compare of lap time, then we can use that in our model of those tyres as well. So some of it isn't even to learn about the team, it's just to learn about tyres from others. But we do try and come up with at the end of testing where we think we sit, because like I said, it will influence some of your decisions going into Bahrain. For the race weekend, how many tyres do you need for quali? How many tyres do you need for the race? Who's your direct competitor going to be? But those questions are very difficult. In previous years where we had multiple days of testing, or 6 days in Barcelona, people would try and do a full race distance. So they try and do the 66 laps of Barcelona. That was always the most useful to try and get pace out of, because you knew they'd started 100, you knew they finished at 0 kg of fuel. So that removed one of the factors that you're always uncertain about. Now, with only 3 days of testing, it's actually a lot of time to do a full race distance. So less and less you're fit to get that information. And the low fuel stuff has so many variables that are really hard to pick through.
Time for another question. Johnny on Instagram, what was the most unexpected thing that came out of a test day during your time in F1? Give us some good testing goss, some good testing stories. Any big surprises?
That was a good question. I think there was a year, many years ago, I can't even remember which team it was with, where we had a really good day testing, a brilliant day testing, and a bit of the suspension was fitted the wrong way around. So everything that we thought we were learning was totally rubbish. We had to go back and check, what actually been on the car and when. And so you get loads of things like that where, because it's the first time the guys are building the car as well. So you get like these little things that go wrong that actually, then you spend a whole day running a test and thinking, oh, wow, okay, we have no idea what's going on now. So that's probably the most surprising one that came out. Yeah, I don't have any more examples than that, I think.
No, that's pretty good. An upside down suspension. Yeah, very good. Joseph on Instagram would like to know, how much are setups dictated by simulator work and how much is actually changed during the day? And also, I guess just run through the schedule of testing for people, because there is a night team, isn't there, that comes in. So you have your day of testing, and then as I understand it, there will be a whole other crew coming in to make all the changes and tweaks that the drivers and teams have decided on during the day.
Yeah, exactly. So the test program would be exactly what you said. So there'll be shift pattern. There'll be day shift and a night shift. The day shift running the car for the hours that were on track, and the night shift making big changes overnight. So, and we'd have loads of meetings in the week running up to the test. What do we want to test? What's the most important things? What learning do we need? And like I say, all the departments going into that, aerodynamic department, the tyre department, the mechanical engineering department, everything coming together. So what you're trying to do at testing is maximise your time on track and minimise your time in the garage. So that sort of dictates a bit of your run plan, because obviously overnight you can make big changes to suspension or setup or whatever the case may be. You can do that overnight change. Obviously the conditions might be a bit different the next day for doing any tests. So if teams have, let's say, 2 types of suspension they want to change, that might happen across days. Some tests, I don't think we have this year, but sometimes we have a proper downtime lunch hour. And sometimes in that time, you'll do a big change, because you don't want to be sat in the garage for 40 minutes when other cars are going around on track. You want to be maximising your time on the track. The starting setup will be set generally a lot based on simulation, what you think your best starting car setup is. But again, there might be things like the aero department often want a rear ride height sweep. So you might start at a very low rear ride height and gradually work your way up and do continuous runs lap after lap at these different ride heights to get a sweep of the car where you think the maximum performance might be. Because like we said earlier, simulation with the best will in the world isn't perfect. Often it's a good guide for what you should do for the car. So if you have understeer, you should change the ride height by X, Y, Z. But it can't often give you the exact numbers that you need to start at. So it's about sort of finding the sensitivity in the aero maps, as we call them. So there's a lot of work going on, and it's a lot to sort of you really want to maximize your learning. So you don't want 2 tests corrupting each other. You need to make sure that you've got clear priorities through the day, And then that needs to be adapted really quickly as things go wrong. So as you get a red flag or different weather, or you have to stop for some reliability issue, you then need to change your test program a little bit to make sure the day runs smoothly. But yes, then you're right, the guys will come in at night to rebuild the car, they get it ready so it's ready for the first day of testing. The only exception to that is maybe the final day of testing. So the final day of testing, the night shift might come in a bit earlier, because the night shift is probably the 2 car crews. So you've got car 1 and car 2. And actually you want both car crews to have some experience of working or building the car, or whatever the case may be. And the final day, both of them are probably in together at the end of the day, such as they can get their first go at live pit stops. And that tends to happen on the last day of the test.
This might be linked then. A follow-up question to that from Jack is, why do teams just run 1 car at testing?
So that's a regulation. It's a really easy answer. So it's a regulation. We'd love to run 2
It's
cars.
the rules.
Yeah, exactly. And we'd love to run 2 cars, but they minimise it to 1. That obviously brings a bit of difficulty because you're trying to share it across drivers. 3 days is hard to split. We've seen most teams now going to splitting the day in half, one driver, another driver. That there's quite a lot of work goes on to change the seat fit or the setup in the car. Even the engineers are changing over potentially from one car to the next. A lot of the radio setup changes, so it's often quite difficult to get that right because there's often a lot of differences between drivers.
I guess if you had 2 cars, you could do quite different things, couldn't you? And you could halve the amount of discovery time, but also probably it does focus minds within a team onto one project. And I guess everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet in that sense.
It's a bit of a split, really. So there would be great advantages to having 2 cars. So like, for example, for strategy, you'd get used to having 2 cars on track. You could be doing all your traffic information correctly. You're learning twice as fast in terms of reliability or aero tests, whatever the case may be. It'd be much harder to get a good gap on track for any of those aero tests, but you would be doing a lot of learning. The 2 car crews would be both learning their cars and their drivers and all of these things together. Because sometimes what happens is you get to 1 car in a test, but you've got all the people that normally work on 2 cars. So you've got, like, the old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth. Yep. It's a bit like that. You've got lots of inputs, and actually you just want the normal 1 car crew.
Grayanne, and I think I've said your name right, apologies if I haven't, on Twitter, she makes the point that Andrea Stella mentioned that not all innovations McLaren wanted to be incorporated are in the launch spec car. Is this a negative? So is this down to schedule, poor planning, or is there logic to doing this? Do you have to understand the basics of your car before you can add in the sort of the nice to haves, the on top of bits?
I guess it depends a bit on what the upgrade is. We've not really got an indication of what they think's coming. Again, in previous years when we had the 2 tests of 3 days each, it would be very, very normal that the car that finished the test was very different to the car that started the test. And I think the cars that were rolled out in testing will be different to what we've seen in the launches last week. Because teams delay bringing upgrades, delay out of our departments as much as they can. So those 2 weeks maybe between components being ready and components being on the car, that makes a difference in terms of wind tunnel time. So I don't think it's necessarily a negative. And, even in these 3 days of testing, the car on day 3 will be different to the car on day 1. Many reasons for that. We'll start to take off sensors that we don't need. The car will get a lot lighter over the test because day 1 you'll have loads of stuff on there. You're trying to check everything. You're trying to check temperatures and pressures and lots going on. So the car on day 3 will be different, and people will still be bringing upgrades on day 3 of the test in advance of the race. So it's not necessarily a negative, and it is good to understand the car before you add these upgrades onto it. But we just don't know what the upgrades are, so we don't have a clear answer. But sounds like they've got stuff coming pretty quickly into the year, which is good.
They were talking it up, weren't they? I mean, Zach Brown certainly was quite strong on his what he thought his chances were for the season.
And they've got to be a favourite given how they finished the end of last year. Yeah. So let's all hope that they're a lot closer to Red Bull.
If they keep the trajectory going from last season, they'll be winning the championship. Final question, really, and we had a lot of questions in for this, and I'm reluctant to put you on the spot here because we haven't had cars on track yet, so I'm not going to ask you for some big season predictions about who you think is going to look good or whatnot. But a lot of questions on the new Red Bull design, and it's obviously caused a little bit of controversy with its sort of them going to this zero pod or almost going to what the Mercedes looked like at the beginning of last year. What are your reads on what's going on at Red Bull? And are you surprised, I guess the question is, are you surprised that they seem to have deviated so strongly from a championship winning car, a dominant car?
So I think maybe years in F1 have made me suspicious. So let's see the car that rocks out on day one at Bahrain, because I'm not sure it's going to be that car. Like, this could just be we're just having a joke.
A dummy car.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm highly suspicious. But let's see. If they do rock out with that car, then, it's a brave move, because they could have easily continued to develop the car they had. And that would have been, I think, the safer bet. The worry is, and we obviously, we know Adrian Newey and the Red Bull team are very, very good, strong aerodynamic designers, have proven that, year after year. But Mercedes obviously felt it could work when they put that first car out with it. They obviously had enough simulation data and aero data and all of these things to say this car is the best we can do. So something, we talked about correlation, something is amiss between what they thought that car could do and what it could actually do. And have Red Bull done the miss in the other direction? And, I'm not surprised they've been working on it, because as soon as you see another car with a very different concept, you start to look at, have you missed something? Or are you working on it? Even a slower car, you start to think, is there something there that we're missing? So I'm not surprised that they've been looking at it in the wind tunnel. I'm not surprised that they've been, experimenting with if they can get more out of it. I'm just surprised that they've gone with it. So they've clearly, if they go with it, they've clearly seen something that means they think they can beat their previous developed car in it. But is there a miss in the simulation that has also convinced Mercedes over the past 2 years to stick with it? So it's if that car rocks out, I'm going to be very interested to see. Bahrain qualifying is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, it probably is the most exciting qualifying of the year from a performance perspective, isn't it? Because no one really knows until that happens.
It's so many decisions are so difficult, even for the top teams in Q1, trying to decide if you need to run again or not. You're not quite sure what the others have given in the first run of Q1. You're not sure if someone's made a mistake and there's loads to come. So all of the decisions in that qualifying are very, very stressful, because even for someone with Red Bull's dominance in previous years, to sit in Q1 and say, we don't think anyone's going to improve by the right amount, we've got no knowledge of what they can do at that point. So it's all of those decisions for all of the teams become much more heightened, and that Q1 is the most stressful session of the year, I would say.
Yeah, well, not far away. So look, just time to tell you at home about all the timings coming up. So pre-season testing is live all this week, Wednesday to Friday across Sky Sports F1. You can watch daily action live from 7 a.m. each day. Then at 8 p.m. each day, there will be a testing wrap followed by Ted's testing notebook, which is back again for another year, and is a brilliant look at everything that's happened. If you don't have time to watch 8 hours a day of cars on track, which, great if you do, but some of us probably don't. Then just 1 week later, we've got the opening race of the 2024 season, the Bahrain Grand Prix. I keep saying this, I said it on last week's podcast, it's a Saturday race. So the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix and the Bahrain Grand Prix this year, both happening on Saturday. Everything moves forward a day. So we've got the race taking place on Saturday, qualifying on Friday, and FP1 and FP2 taking place on Thursday. I think that's it. I can't believe we're about to go racing.
It's
cars on track.
A long winter, and everyone's ready to see the cars on track. So I'm so ready for Bahrain.
Yeah, absolutely. Bernie, thank you for your time. That was a fascinating chat. Really, really interesting. I learned a huge amount. And I might go see if I can pick up some Flovis down at the local hardware store.
Definitely need to have a play with it.
Yeah. Nice one, Benny. Thank you very much. And we'll be back next week with our season preview podcast. Hope you can join us then. Bye for now.
Bye.